Hi, I'm John Fluevog, and I thought I'd just read you a little bit of my book, and we'll see how that goes. I hope you enjoy it. I know that what people say about my shoes. Creative, original, funky, sassy, groovy, artistic. The funny thing is, I didn't have a clue that I was artistic until I was in my 30s. I didn't even like artistic people. I thought they were kind of sketchy. Weird, eh? Well, it turns out that I'm both practical and creative. That was quite a discovery for the kid who was dyslexic and bad in school, who almost didn't graduate, and who never really knew what he wanted to be when he grew up. A lot of my life was me not thinking I was good at things, and then finding out later that actually I was okay. It's been 50 years since I've been selling and making shoes, and after all this time, I've just started to understand who I am. It's taken me long to realize that my business has been my spiritual journey. And now I'd like to encourage and maybe inspire others who are setting out on the same path. So let's start at the beginning. No, let's start before the beginning. I was born on May the 15th, 1948. Yep, get your calculator out there. To Ruth and Sigurd Fluevog in the city of Vancouver, British Columbia, on the far left of the west coast of the North American continent. My sister Gail followed 3 years later, and my brother Glenn 5 years later, and after that we have an older sister too, Karen, who was born in 1943. We had a very free childhood, even when I was little. I rode my bike everywhere. We lived at 6th and Fraser in Vancouver. One day when I was 11 or so, I rode my bike all the way home across what was then known as the Second Narrows Bridge, up a steep hill in North Vancouver and back again. It must have been, I don't know, 20, 30 kilometers, maybe more. The bridge which spans the Bard Inlet had just been finished, and it was crazy and dangerous and a little bit scary. But we went off and did stuff like that back then. We had no restrictions on us. My dad was an eccentric character, quite smart, a big personality, and the kind of guy who's never embarrassed by the moniker of Sigurd Cornelius Fluevog. Royalty, right? Well, he was the kind of man he was a big influence in my life, and it took me a long time to get over being Sig's son, because that's what I was, Sigurd's son. I didn't have an identity of my own for a long time. When Sigurd was often critical, but Sigurd was often critical and demanding. My mother was loving and kind. She encouraged us to do whatever we wanted to do as long as we were good and believed in God. That was the criteria. They were both devout Christians. In fact, my mother had always said that she married my dad because he was the only true Christian around. Their faith was a huge influence on me, and as a child, and for a long time after that, even now. My parents grew up in a rural Alberta farm community. My dad in Irma, and my mother in Kinsella. But my grandparents were pioneers in the truest sense of the word. My father's parents came from Norway and homesteaded in South Dakota and Minnesota before heading up to Alberta. Their names were originally Nielsen, but there were so many Nielsens in Minnesota, the mail kept getting mixed up. So my grandfather, Nicholas Tobias Matthias, changed it to Fluevog, which was inspired by the rural name of the tiny hamlet back in Norway where the family came from. So there's also a lake up in Alberta near where my grandparents homesteaded called Fluevog Lake. I never met my father's folks, although I wished I had. They died back in the 30s when my dad was in his 20s. My dad told me that his mother, Gina, died first, and then his father died not long after, 6 months later from a heartache. So my grandfather was tender-hearted, and I think I'm a bit that way myself. On my mother's side, there were Dutch and German. There's a bit of Irish thrown into the mix. And when he was just 8 years old, my grandfather, Ben Wachter, drove the horses and mules along the Oregon Trail all the way up to Wilbur, Western Washington. He eventually became, he became a farmer. I don't really think he did, so I'm reading it from my book, which I wrote. But anyway, in Alberta, and he actually ended up working on the railways. He was a true pioneer. My grandmother, Clara, was a big, imposing woman who came from Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri. And she married Ben, and they stayed at home, and she stayed at home to look after the house and family. when we were kids, we'd go on lots of road trips to the farm. It had no running water, no paved roads, but tons and tons of bugs. It was as natural as can be. In summer, it would get so hot when we were driving that we'd cook chuck wagon dinners on the manifold of the car. At Christmas, it would be too cold to drive to church, and we'd go out with the horses in the sleigh. So that was old school, right? And that's what I grew up in. So that's what I'm going to read to you so far. That's it. Thanks for listening.